right. I beat Matt. I'm off to a good start. Hey, everybody. Happy Monday. Welcome to the State Department. And just at the top, obviously, yesterday, as you all know, Prime Minister Abadi announced the start of Iraqi operations to liberate Mosul from Daesh. As you heard President Obama and the Prime Minister himself say earlier this month, this is certainly not going to be an easy struggle, but we're confident that the brave Iraqi forces, with the support of the international coalition, will eventually be victorious in this effort. The United States wishes the Iraqi forces success in the battle ahead, and as leader of the coalition, supports Iraqi efforts to rid Mosul, Nineveh, and all of Iraq of these terrorist gangs. At the Iraqi government's request, the U.S. will continue to provide training, advice, and assistance to complete this critical mission. The United States will also continue to support the humanitarian efforts led by the government of Iraq to help displaced Iraqis return to their homes and rebuild their lives. We recognize this is going to be a considerable challenge, but we have coordinated closely with Iraqi authorities and NGOs to be as prepared as possible. We also welcome the announcement over the weekend that Syrian opposition forces, assisted by our ally Turkey and the counter-ISIL coalition, liberated the Syrian town of Dabiq from Daesh control. Dabiq is not only a significant military defeat to Daesh, but it also represents a serious blow to the terrorist group's twisted ideology. Matt, that's it.
Right. Well, you caught me by surprise. You can go on and on and on. I'm sure we'll get back to Iraq and Syria in a minute, but I want to start with the kind of news of the day on the emails and the release of these FBI 302.
Sure.
I guess the allegation, I guess I would first ask you to address on camera the allegations made in one that there was an offer,
Sure,
a quid pro quo for a declassification.
Sure.
Can you speak to that?
I certainly can. So the allegation of any kind of quid pro quo is inaccurate and does not align with the facts. So there was no quid pro quo. And I would note, first of all, that the FBI, I think this past weekend, put out a statement strongly refuting that there was any kind of quid pro quo. So just to outline, just so other folks know what we're talking about, I'm sure everyone does, but there was an allegation that there was some kind of exchange for us to, or for the FBI not to upgrade one of the emails among the 55,000 that we put out from the FOIA request in exchange for increasing FBI slots in Baghdad. So just to walk people through this, first of all, the State Department did actually upgrade the document at the request of the FBI when it was released back in May of 2015, and everyone can see it on our website. And secondly, there were no increase in FBI slots in Iraq that resulted from this conversation. So what did occur, just to clarify, Undersecretary Kennedy, Pat Kennedy, sought to understand the FBI's process for withholding certain information from public release. And as all of you know, throughout this process, we were very clear in talking about, at times, that this was the decision to upgrade or not upgrade certain parts of emails was a topic of discussion among our interagency colleagues about whether certain information should or should not be upgraded in classification. And as we also know, individuals with classification authorities often have, or sometimes have, different views on how to do that, or whether something should be upgraded. So, so again, no quid pro quo, no exchange here, just simply a request from our Undersecretary, Pat Kennedy, clarify the reasoning or the rationale behind upgrading.
Why would he have raised the issue of additional slots for the FBI? I mean,
So my understanding- right, no,
I get that you say there was no quid pro quo, but was it ever discussed?
It was, so he just raised it, this
A
official.
quid pro quo was discussed.
No, let me clarify here. I thought you were talking about the additional slots.
No,
in
no, no,
Rock.
no. I'm gonna get to that in a second, but I wanna know first, was there even if it didn't happen in the end,
No,
there was no discussion?
no.
Just so we're perfectly clear, there was no discussion of any quid pro quo? There was
I'll
no
let-
discussion of any quid pro quo?
I'm sorry, there was,
There was no discussion of any quid pro quo?
No, there was no
Was
discussion.
there any discussion of any kind of an exchange?
No.
With regard to classification procedures on the one hand and FBI slots at US embassies abroad on the other?
no.
Thanks.
Okay, have you read the FBI 302? Because that is not what it says in black and white. I'll read it to you right here. It uses the term quid pro quo. Those are the words of the FBI agent. And then it says, in exchange for marking the email unclassified, state would reciprocate by allowing the FBI to place more agents in countries where they are presently forbidden. I mean, this conflicts directly with what you're saying today.
I'm sorry, and I can speak to, the fact that 302s are simply interviews conducted by the FBI.
So you're saying the FBI agent either got it wrong or is lying in this 302?
I can't speak to what his or her intentions were saying these kinds of things, but clearly expressing a personal opinion about what happened. All I can say is, as I understand the course of events, Catherine, as I understand this, Catherine, this was any idea or any really assertion that this was somehow tit for tat or a quid pro quo exchange of in that manner really, frankly, is insulting. This was a process that we worked diligently through the interagency with, including the FBI. Did we have disagreements regarding classification upgrades? Certainly, and we have discussed that at length. We've talked about the fact that sometimes upgrades are, and we talked about this, are more art than science. Let me finish.
Okay, go ahead.
We talked about that there were strong disagreements on whether to upgrade some of this material.
That is not what this
I-
302 says.
again-
It says right here, listen, please.
Okay,
Kennedy
sure.
spent the next 15 minutes debating the classification of the email and attempting to influence the FBI to change its markings. Is that in keeping with the high ethical standards of the State Department?
Could you read that to me one more time?
Yes. Kennedy spent the next 15 minutes debating the classification of the email and attempting to influence the FBI to change its markings. Is that in keeping with the high ethical standards of the State Department?
Well, look, I'm not going to debate every point and every excerpt from these 302s, but what you just read to me sounds like it was a discussion on whether a certain portion of the email should or should not be classified. We, Pat Kennedy, all of us at the State Department are going to make their case as best they can. That's called interagency exchange
Well,
and,
this
and
is-
the kind
I
of
would
discussions
really-
that we carry out all the
I
time.
would strongly suggest you read the
Please, ma'am.
302 because this is the paragraph after the FBI agent specifically uses the term quid pro quo. This is no small thing.
I understand
The senior
that.
executive
I
is
understand
accused
that.
of trying to
I understand that,
bribe
which is
an
why I came
agent.
out here and said there's no quid pro quo.
Well, it
Absolutely
never
not.
happened, but there was clearly a discussion of
There was a
having
discussion over the classification of this material. There was no
It reads like you
implicit
scratch my
or-
back, I'll scratch yours. I'm sorry, final question.
Sure.
From me. Congressman Chaffetz and Congressman Nunez have called for the immediate removal of Patrick Kennedy.
That's their prerogative, but I can say that Pat Kennedy is going to remain at his job, and he has the full confidence of the Secretary of State.
Are you saying then that the conversation, this 15 minutes of back and forth, was unrelated?
No, I'm sorry, we got pulled aside here, but
Wait, you're basically saying, yes, there was, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, you're saying there was this 15-minute exchange, or however long the exchange was, about the classification, but you're saying that it was not related to the placement of FBI personnel.
so my understanding of the conversation was, certainly there was the conversation, Pat Kennedy reached out to this individual in order to talk about the classification. After that discussion took place, at the end of this conversation, the individual at the FBI took advantage, or not, not that sounds bad, but he was on the phone with Pat Kennedy and took advantage of that fact to raise the issue of more
So you're
FBI
saying-
slots in Baghdad.
So you're saying that.
I'm sorry.
That it was that it was,
So the agency's
So-
gotta be lying then, if that's your position. I mean, this is a really serious thing. You're saying that the FBI agent's recollection of what happened is incorrect, or that they misled the person who interviewed them in this 302.
Catherine, all I can do is stand up here and give you the facts as we understand them to be, and I've done so. I can't speak to what this person's intent, whether they misunderstood the atmosphere of that conversation. I have no idea. All I can say is that there was no quid pro quo. Excuse me.
can you,
Please, Matt.
yeah, so what the documents say that Pat Kennedy wanted to happen with this was to get it to be declared, I think it's B9, is that correct?
Yeah, which is also another source of confusion. But let me. So yes, what he wanted to do was question the. What he called up this individual to discuss was whether a certain portion needed to be upgraded in classification. They did talk about it. Frankly, at the end of it, and I said this at the top, we did upgrade the document. So there was no.
I don't, but
There
this
was no
B-
exemption. What I think so just to clarify, you said a B9 exemption. We looked at that. I think that was some kind of garble. There is a B7 law enforcement redaction that he may have been referring to. We don't know. Pat Kennedy. He would have, again, we're trying to
Okay.
reconstruct this, but there's a B7 law enforcement redaction that from state's perspective would have been applicable, but it's not a B9 exemption.
All right, well, but
Because a
that,
B9, because then again, the assertion with a B9 is that it somehow would be like off the grid and.
well, yeah,
and-
because
and
that's
put
what it
some
says in
kind
the
of basement.
302, that it would be
But it's
filed
not,
away
it's on the
forever and-
website.
Huh?
It's
No,
on the
I
website.
know that yeah, but
No,
the
we
discussion
did not.
was apparently an attempt to have it classified in such a way or marked in such a way that it would never be released at all, because it would have been
No.
exempt under the
So
FOIA standard.
what it would have been was, again, all we can conjecture is that there was some kind of garble here. He explained that from state's perspective, it would be to use a B7 law enforcement redaction. It's just a form of redaction, but that still would have, the document still would have been released on the website.
It would have been,
Yes.
okay, but that's not the case with the B9.
Yes, I think that's true.
Okay,
with the
so
B9.
there was you're saying that there was some kind of confusion between B9 and B7.
That's all we can
All right.
consider, yeah.
Why
All
then-
we can
okay.
conjecture.
In the end,
Yeah.
regardless of what happened in the discussion and whether or not there was a talk of a quid pro quo or not, you guys agreed to
Upgrade.
upgrade it. Why wasn't it classified at the beginning when it was sent? That's what I don't understand.
Well, we talked about this a lot. I mean, that as we went through these, all these emails, you know this, Matt, I mean, we upgraded a lot of them. That was what we looked at was not necessarily whether it
But
was
this-
classified at the time it was sent, but whether it needed to be classified before public release.
Yeah, but that was, most of that was for FOIA exemptions. There was classification issues as well, but most of that was, this was
Yeah, but there were.
redacted, this was redacted because it was classified.
But that also happened. I mean,
Why?
as we went through, I mean, I don't know
But I
the
guess the
number of
point is
cases.
that if you guys agreed in the aftermath to upgrade it, and maybe we're going over old ground here, but it's just, because
I
this
think
has
we
come-
are.
But because it's come up again, I think it's important to address.
I mean, I think we are.
If you guys
Yeah,
agreed
that's
in
okay.
the end that it wasn't declassified and should be redacted, why wouldn't it have been classified in the first place and not sent to an unsecure private email server?
So, for a variety of reasons, and we talked about this at the time, but I'm happy to say it again, is certain information which may not have been classified at the time for various sensitivities or reasons, when we looked at it again before public release, we upgraded the classification. And I don't know I actually don't know what this was even upgraded to, this particular document, but we did upgrade to confidential in several cases. I don't have the number in front of me. We talked about that, I think, and I can get you more details on that. It was
Yeah,
part of the
I-
process of just, as we went through, and we did, and that was, again, part of this interagency process that's detailed in this 302, was, we did this internally, but then we shipped out these, when they had other departments, other agencies' equities, we shipped them out to them for also to be reviewed.
And do you know the date of the conversation?
Darn, and you're gonna get me here. I do not have the date, I'm sorry.
Can,
Wait,
can,
wait, what do you, you talking
the
about the
date
date
of
of
the
the
15
email or the date?
No, the
Okay.
date of the date of the conversation between Pat
I'll
Kennedy
get that
and
for
the
you.
FBI.
I can get that for you.
Yeah, because I don't, unless I'm mistaken, I don't think it's in the 302.
Yeah, no, and oddly enough, I have the date of the email in question, but not the date of the conversation. Of course,
Because, okay, these FBI interviews were done with two separate FBI officials, and the State Department's position is that they both messed it up and they got it wrong.
you're asking me?
Yeah, that's.
I mean,
that's,
look, I would
think
refer you
that's
to the
their
FBI to
position.
speak to their
Well, no, I
their
think
own assessments. I mean,
these
they're
are-
not, so first of all, 302s are not transcripts, they're summaries.
that's
Secondly,
but that's
I'm not
but
gonna,
that's routine
secondly,
for
I'm not
FBI.
gonna parse every section or every sentence in every 302. Director Comey said at the time, was that there are no charges appropriate in this case, talking about the investigation that they conducted. And that remains a fact.
I'm just trying to be clear in my own
course.
mind. You
course. Go ahead.
dispute the content of the FBI interviews, and I'm just trying to point out that these were two separate interviews with two different FBI officials. And
Sure.
the State Department's position is that they're both wrong.
We dispute the assertion that there was any kind of quid pro quo involving the case of upgrading an email in exchange for additional slots for FBI officials in Baghdad. We refute that assumption, or that allegation,
Could have been
rather.
another one, something else.
I'm just saying, I don't want to get into like parsing out every 302 out there, but I'm saying essentially what I'm refuting.
I'm just trying to make the point that it's just not one person who says this happened.
understand,
It's in
Catherine.
fact
I
two
understand
FBI
that.
agents who say it happened.
I understand that, and again, I can't speak to why they said what they said, but I will refer everyone to the fact that the FBI, sorry, Nick, I'll get to you, did put out a statement over the weekend also saying there was no quid pro quo.
They say it didn't happen, but they acknowledge that there was a discussion of additional slots overseas in the same conversation of making revisions to the classification that would have benefited the State Department.
We can go back and forth, Catherine, I'm just saying, I'm just repeat myself, please.
Okay.
You talked about there was this discussion where Kennedy was trying to understand how these emails were designated, but do you dispute that he sought to have a designation changed on these emails?
You're saying, I don't dispute that. In fact, I mean, well, he contacted the FBI in order to understand what their rationale was for requesting an upgrade of this particular information. So it was a discussion about the classification of this
Because
information.
the 302s seem, I mean, setting aside the issue of a quid pro quo, they're pretty explicit that it's not just him seeking to understand how this happens, it's him seeking to change a designation.
Well, again, he initiated the call to clarify or to understand what the rationale was behind it. In that exchange, he may have, and I think, I didn't argue that when she put that forward, given our views or his views on whether that should or should not be classified. That's just a conversation. If you and I had a disagreement over
Sure, but
something, I would
one
expect
is-
us to discuss, I would put forth my argument for not classifying.
The other question is
Please.
just a quick follow-up.
Yes, sir.
There's also a mention in this report that there was this seventh floor group or, shadow government that convened with John Feiner and several other
Yeah.
high-ranking officials. I mean, does that indicate that former Secretary Clinton was getting special treatment? Why was there? the
No,
need for
this is really, I mean, look, this was, so a couple of points to make. One is that, given the profile of this release of emails, the department took it very seriously and brought together senior State Department staffers to work through how we were going to get through this process, through this 55,000 emails, and release them publicly. And pages, sorry, I apologize, thank you. Pages, and release them publicly in a process that involved not just a lot of allocating of resources within our own department, but also managing, as we can see, an interagency process of whether, or clearing this material for public release. It was a pretty extraordinary effort, and as such, there was responsibly, I would say, there was high-level attention to detail to this. Please, go ahead.
Just to be clear, is it who brought up the question of additional slots for FBI personnel?
The FBI.
abroad? The
official,
FBI.
Yeah. And as I understand, it was a kind of like, after the conversation took place about the upgrade and classification, at the end of that, there was a kind of, oh, by the way, hey, we're looking at, upgrading, we want more slots. And there was a discussion about that.
And
So
then-
a clear pivot to another.
Okay, so can I finish, please? Can I finish, Miss? So Kennedy, to your knowledge, never brought up the issue of additional slots for the FBI, correct?
No.
Okay. Secondly, the agent who is quoted as raising, it was quoted as saying that there was a quid pro quo discussed. To your understanding, was that agent party to the actual conversation or not?
I'm not sure, to be honest. That's a very good question. That's a very good question.
Can we move on? I understand that the email issue is quite cathartic. and
Sure.
We can talk about it endlessly. But
Okay,
we got,
last one, and then last one.
Thank you. There's a separate email in which someone, I believe a diplomatic security official, says that the Clinton in her tenure blatantly disregarded security and diplomatic protocols. They specifically mention her decision to travel in motorcades with Huma Abedin instead of ambassadors, which they said caused insult and embarrassment. Has there been any kind of, during her tenure, had there been any kind of formal complaints lodged about either of these, either the assertion of security protocols or diplomatic protocols?
So, first of all, every Secretary of State, including Secretary Clinton and his or her immediate staff, work very closely with diplomatic security. John Kerry is no different, to make sure that department business can be carried out under a variety of security conditions. And finding that balance of security but also effectiveness is a constant effort and requires close coordination. With regard to the limo and who sat in there, there's no official protocol for seating arrangement in the Secretary's motorcade. I've seen it in myself personally work many different ways. Sometimes I'll ride with the Secretary if I'm going on the way to a media interview with him. I need to prep him for that. And then in that case, the ambassador from that country may not ride in that motorcade. So it just depends on what is the business at hand and how to use the Secretary's time most efficiently. There was one more question on there. I can't remember.
Were any formal complaints lodged?
I'm not aware that there were, but I can't answer that definitively. I just don't have that information available to me.
Is that something you could get back to me on?
I can try. I can try. I just would say though that, and I'm looking for a particular quote, but I don't want the impression that somehow. Well, here it is. In the last batch of 302s, the head of diplomatic security during Secretary Clinton's tenure described her as very responsive to security issues. So it's just another opinion.
can we move
Please,
on?
yep.
Thank you. We go to Iraq, Mosul?
We can go to Iraq, yes.
Okay. Well, tell me, you have 100,000 soldiers that are, converging on Mosul, to fight something like, I don't know, maybe 4,000 ISIS fighters and so on, including apparently about 5,000 Americans and so on. Who is taking command of this operation?
The Iraqi government.
So are
It's
you
under
telling-
Iraqi command and control.
Okay, and the Iraqi command and control, which means that American forces are taking orders from the Iraqi commanders in the battle?
I'm sorry, the American?
American
No, we're there, look, we're there as
I
to
understand.
train and advise, and
Good.
we're working there, sorry, I don't mean to talk over you, but we're working there with the clear understanding that this is an Iraqi-led operation.
I fully understand
Yeah.
that, Mark, but I'm saying
Sorry.
that you have American forces, whether it's a dozen or 5,000, it doesn't make any difference. Do they take orders from the Iraqi commanders on the ground? What is the relationship in this command and control structure?
I would, frankly, for the best explanation of that, I'd refer you to the Pentagon.
Okay.
But we operate in Iraq with a clear understanding that it is the Iraqi government who is running this operation.
Okay. Now, I know that you, and when Mr. McGurk was here, he spoke about the humanitarian effort and all these things and all the logistics and so on. But now with the fall of Dabiq in Syria, are you concerned that you have this, again, I mean, I asked John about this hydraulic effect you have, all these fighters going into Syria, into Deir ez-Zor, into other areas, maybe into Raqqa, all these things. What are the safety valves in place to prevent that from happening?
Just to be clear, you're saying that fighters leaving or
Fighters
departing
from
to be,
Mosul, right,
or
yeah.
you're talking about
I'm
kind of
talking
a
about
cross flow or them?
ISIS fighters, Daesh fighters.
Yeah.
Moving from Mosul and going on to elsewhere where you would have to fight them again, because I think the U.S. is also preparing to do something in Raqqa. So,
Sure.
there you go, this hydraulic effect.
Sir, I'm very hesitant to give, given that I'm a career diplomat and not a military man, but I think it's safe to assume that military planners are looking at how to prevent that kind of movement from happening. And certainly, any prudent planning would take that under consideration. You don't certainly want, as you said, fighters fleeing from one area to another area only to retrench and fight again. But that's always a possibility.
And my last question
Please.
On this, because there was also fear of ethnic cleansing or revenge, much as happened in Tikrit and so on. And that's why apparently Shia forces like Al-Hashd al-Shabi, the popular mobilization units, are prevented. Could you confirm, or could you share anything with us on this issue?
On the issue of
On the issue of, what are the safety measures taken?
well, I know, sure, I know that the government of Iraq, in coordination with the Kurdistan Regional Government and the Nineveh governor, have been and continue to plan for this, for post-Daesh or post-ISIL governance of Nineveh province, and have established a stabilization committee comprising representatives from both bodies, the UN, Germany, and the U.S. And I know Prime Minister Abadi has empowered provincial leaders, governors, in fact, in Anbar and Salah ad-Din, to work with the UN to address local needs and stabilize communities liberated from ISIL. And UNDP has also, I know, increased staffing and capacity to support stabilization activities. That includes pre-positioning $13 million worth of equipment. And I think, these efforts are ongoing. We've learned from past operations, Ramallah, Fallujah, sorry?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. That you can win the battle, but not the war, in the sense of, it's what's really important is in the aftermath that you have pre-positioned assistance and that you've got an infrastructure there that's able to get citizens back who've been displaced by the fighting back into the cities. And frankly, we've been pretty successful so far in that effort. Please. Oh, of course. Yeah.
Numbers. I think Samir said, and I think you assented to the notion that there are 5,000 American troops among the forces converging on Mosul.
I don't think, sure, go ahead
Isn't
and finish your
that
question.
more the number of U.S. troops overall
Yes.
in Iraq?
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't have the number in front of me, but yes, we're there to
No
train and advise.
representations about how many troops are actually with the Iraqi forces.
I don't. I'd have to refer you to the Pentagon. Thanks. Yeah. Please.
To follow up on Saeed's question about the sectarian dimensions,
Of course.
the two points that I'd appreciate your comment on. One is, in today's coverage of the liberation of Mosul, the major U.S. media like the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal are carrying pictures showing Iraqi units preparing for the offensive, and they're flying Shiite flags. So given the concern about sectarianism, is this issue of concern to you, the Iraqi units with the sectarian flags?
Well, I'll get to your question. Sorry, Said, I found a couple more things I wanted to just address in your first question about the fleeing of fighters. And I was looking for it when I answered, but I just found it. So as Iraqi security forces push towards Mosul, they are already identifying and working to identify escape routes and communicating also directions to civilians as the offensive proceeds. And the overall plan envisions that there will be security screenings that will be carried out by Iraqi and Kurdish forces and civilian agencies, including the Ministry of Migration and Displacement and the Ministry of Transportation. And they're going to register and move civilians from screening sites to settlements. So that's an important component. So they're not only going to work to receive civilians as they flee the fighting, but also screen these civilians to make sure that Daesh fighters aren't intermingling with them or trying to seek escape that way. Sorry, over to your question, which was about concerns about sectarian.
The Iraqi army units flying the Shia flags.
Look, I mean, we have talked about at length these local security forces on the ground, Kurdish and others, who have been very effective fighting forces against Daesh. But again, I go back to what I said before, which is that certainly we want these forces to recognize Iraqi government leadership and command and control, but also Prime Minister Abadi has been very clear that he won't accept any kind of sectarianism, and that any credible allegations of human rights abuses will be investigated.
Well, okay, let me.
Sure.
I mean, it's not clear. I mean,
Go ahead.
these newspapers describe them as Iraqi forces. It's not clear that, and they're not local. They could be Hashd al-Shaabi. They could be the Iraqi army. It's not clear, but those were the pictures. The second part of my question. Mm-hmm. The Syrian Foreign Ministry issued a statement that Syria welcomes the announcement of the start of the Mosul offensive and declares its strong support for the Iraqi government and army and the forces supporting it, including the popular mobilization units, i.e. the Hashd al-Shaabi. I mean, this is. What's your comment on that?
I don't really have one, honestly. Syrian regime has been much more focused on going after moderate Syrian opposition in and around Aleppo than going after Daesh. We've talked before about the fact that we've seen, frankly, collusion between the Syrian regime and Daesh in Syria. Where we're focused, our efforts in Syria in fighting Daesh are with the different ethnic groups in northern Syria who have been very effective fighting forces against Daesh and really have put Daesh on the defensive in many parts of Syria. Last question. Sorry.
Yeah, you don't see this Syrian comment as part of a sectarian kind of alignment that's building up around Mosul among the Shia in Damascus, Baghdad, and Tehran?
We're confident at this point that the Iraqi government is in command and control of the operation, and that these forces recognize that, and that there is a structure and coordination mechanism set up that where we see any kind of problems arising, that they'll be able to be addressed.
More questions, please. Thank
Please.
You. The same. So about the timing of the operation.
Sure.
Today, President Barzani said, even though there have been military planning, that he wished to see political planning as well for a post-ISIS Mosul. In other words, he hinted that there is no post-political planning. I just wonder whether the United, and then he said, our friends rushed this a little bit. I just wonder whether the United States played any role in making sure the operation happens at this time before President Obama leaves office or before the November elections.
Not at all. We've been very clear that this is an Iraqi-led operation, and it's for the Iraqi authorities to decide when and where that takes place. Our role, as we've said all along, has been to support them as best we can through training, advisement, as well as assistance in terms of equipment and other forms of assistance.
But this is what Vice President Biden told Iraqi Kurdistan
But-
president on August 31st. It says the leaders underscored the urgency of sustained progress in the fight against ISIL. Then it goes on towards liberating Mosul, to liberate Mosul. So it's clear that Biden urged the Barzani
But,
to.
well, I certainly don't want to get into a back and forth with President Barzani, but I do want to emphasize in talking about governance in the area, and I just said this, I mean, look, we for our part have stepped up our police training and our work with locally based fighters so that we can hold the gains that the Iraqi security forces make in and around Mosul. That's going to require, and we recognize, continued attention to Iraqi efforts to mobilize Nineveh police and locally based fighters so that they can provide security in Mosul and the broader province in the aftermath of fighting. And as Mosul's cleared of ISIL, the Iraqi army will begin the process to hand over responsibility to hold forces, if you will, who can take over security of the city. The Iraqi security forces are making preparations to hand over control of Sharqat to the Iraqi police and other hold forces. And then, as I just answered to Saeed, there's also, a planning mechanism with the governor of Iraq. It's already working in coordination with the governor of, with the Kurdistan regional government as well as the Nineveh governor in planning for post-ISIL governance in
To
Nineveh.
be clear, can you just say explicitly that the United States played no role in the timing of the operation?
Yes, I can say that explicitly.
On Iraq too, Turkey is insisting to play a role in the liberation of Mosul. What role it's playing?
I would let Turkey speak to its role and even its desired role. We've been very clear about this, and I'll say it again, any foreign military activities in Iraq must have the consent of the Iraqi government. We continue to support dialogue between the governments of Iraq and Turkey to resolve any disagreements on what role they may or may not play.
Do you know if they are playing any role in coordination with the coalition, not with the Iraqi government?
Well, I know they're conducting a training program in Bashika, but I don't know.
This time,
Yeah, I would leave it for the Turkish government to define what role they're playing.
Since when is it the position of the United States that any foreign military action in Iraq must have the consent of the Iraqi government?
Well, I've said that
Since you invaded and threw the guy out, threw the guy you didn't like out?
previous
Does this
regime,
apply to
previous
Syria
regime
as
and previous
well?
set of circumstances. What I can speak to is
Can you replace
today
Iraq with
with
Syria?
a democratically
in that
elected
sentence?
government in Iraq, and I would not hold the same standard to previous governments in Iraq, nor would I hold the same standards to the current government in Syria. We
Okay.
respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Iraq.
So if you're a leader or a government that the United States does not believe is legitimate or was democratically elected, then all bets are off?
I think
They have no sovereignty?
no, but we have said that when in the imminent national security interest of the United States, but we're getting off tangent, we're getting off topic.
Well, I
here.
don't know. I
We'll
just
act
find it a
accordingly.
bit surprising that you guys pick and choose when it is that that a government has the right to, or that foreign militaries can't operate unless they have this express consent of a country's government.
In the case of Iraq, in the case of democratically elected governments.
So,
yes,
are you saying
please.
that in effect, if the Turks start marching into Mosul as part of this operation, the U.S. will still not have an opinion? Will still say it's the Iraqi something?
All
for
right, I
Iraqis
think
to
that this is
sort out?
something that the Turkish government is fully capable of speaking and discussing and working through this to coordinate with the Iraqi government. And again, I mean, let's take a step back here. This is about enabling the Iraqi security forces and the Iraqi government to carry out this operation to rid the country of Daesh and to provide security for the people of Iraq. This is a long-term gain here, because if they can do that, then they can, move forward democratically, politically, and grow economically, and provides greater stability going forward. So any operation that they're conducting right now within Iraq, we believe should be done with the consent of the Iraqi government. That's not saying it can't be done or that that's unachievable. What we're saying is the two should talk.
Mark, do you call Turkey to withdraw from Bashika after they've done with the
I
training?
didn't hear what you just said.
Do you call Turkey to withdraw from Bashika since the Iraqi government doesn't want them to be there and they've done with the training work?
All we're saying is that any steps they take should be done in coordination with the Iraqi government. Please, yeah.
But to clear this point,
Okay.
the Iraqi government has asked the Turks to withdraw from Iraq, and they want to be involved in the liberation of Mosul. What's your position on this? Do you call Turkey to leave Iraq, to stay there, not to intervene? They don't want to coordinate with the Iraqi government.
What we want to see is both governments focus on who the common enemy is here, and that is ISIL.
Mark, do you agree that Turkish
Thank you.
troops were started their training program with the permission of Iraqi government?
I'm not going to get into past history, please.
And the Red Cross say they're preparing for hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing the Battle of Mosul. When I asked John Kirby last week about civilians trying to leave Aleppo, he said they shouldn't have to leave. Do you think civilians in Mosul shouldn't leave?
Well, again, it's not a question of whether we think they should or should not have to leave, but we're recognizing the fact that a real challenge to this operation is going to be dealing with displaced civilians. And that's something we've been working diligently on. In fact, I've committed a lot of money and a lot of effort to help the Iraqis and other local government officials to address. And we've also been working, learning from past efforts, Tikrit, Ramadi, and others. But how you can coordinate with the Iraqi government, with the UN, and with the international community, that you can at least mitigate some of the effects of this displacement that's somewhat inevitable in an operation of this scale.
What measures is the U.S. taking to create conditions for civilians not to leave Mosul?
Well, again, there have been a number of there's been a lot of preparatory work done in advance of this offensive. We've contributed more than $1.1 billion in humanitarian assistance. And as you may recall, over the summer, we secured additional pledges of over $2.3 billion from our partners for humanitarian assistance, stabilization, and demining, all in the run-up to this attack or this offensive to liberate Mosul. They'll probably need to raise more money, but at least we've got a considerable sum to start with. And the response is going to be Iraqi-led, UN-coordinated effort. We're playing a supportive role, but the government of Iraq, with support of humanitarian agencies, is taking steps to prepare emergency shelter for up to 250,000 internally displaced persons. And UN agencies have pre-positioned relief supplies and continue to build stockpiles to provide shelter and other humanitarian aid for up to 1 million people. So I guess my response is, this is a major military offensive. It's going to take a lot of time. I think we recognize that citizens are going to be, and civilians are going to be displaced. We've seen this before elsewhere in Iraq, and we're trying to learn from those past efforts. And by we, I mean collectively, not just the United States. and how to mitigate some of those effects.
Syria, I have one on Syria. May I?
Finish with Iraq,
On Iraq.
and then I have to run. I apologize.
What about the routes, all this preparation being made for people who are displaced, but what about routes for them to get out of the city safely?
Well, I talked a little bit about that in response to Saeed's question. But we talked about the fact that we've got routes set up and that there's screening processes to take place, working with various ministries in Iraq where displaced people will be screened. There are shelters or areas set up where these people can be housed in temporary shelters, and also screened, as I just said in response to Saeed's question, for potentially for ISIL fighters who may be trying to intermingle or mix in with the civilian population.
On Syria? On Syria.
Can I just, two questions, starting with you, and then I'll get to you, Saeed.
Thanks.
What's your question
on Syria? So an announcement came from the Russian Defense Ministry that says Russian and Syrian forces will stop all strikes in eastern Aleppo on October 20th. It says militants can leave the city unimpeded through certain corridors. It also calls on the militants to remove mines and other hazards at humanitarian corridors to allow civilians to leave eastern Aleppo. It says shelter and medical help are guaranteed for all civilians leaving eastern Aleppo. What is your reaction to this announcement?
Well, look, the people of Aleppo have been subjected to near constant bombardment and airstrikes, frankly, over the past years, but most intensively the past month or so. It's killed scores of civilians. It's leveled much of the civilian infrastructure in the city in what at best can only be perceived as a way to starve out and to drive out the opposition and civilians who've held on there for so long. I guess we'll see. If there is actually an 8-hour pause in the unremitting suffering of the people of Aleppo, that would be a good thing. But frankly, it's a bit too little too late. Please.
I just wanted to follow up on the same issue. Do you see this as a warning by the Russians? That that an assault a major assault is forthcoming?
I would hope not. I mean, we had good discussions in Lausanne over the weekend. Russia was there as part of that group that met. We've agreed to move forward in that format and talk about new ideas to bring about a real cessation of hostilities. So the last thing we want to do is see an uptick in the assault in Aleppo.
Could the Russian proposal be part of those talks? As a result of those Lausanne talks?
Perhaps you'd have to ask them. Thanks, guys. Yeah, please.
I just want to very quickly on Egypt, and that is
sure. You're right. Okay.
the detained American. She's been held now for
Yes.
900 days. Aya Hijazi.
You're talking about Hijazi. We're aware, obviously, that she's been detained for more than 2 years. I'm talking about Ms. Hijazi, is currently on trial. We continue to call for an expeditious resolution to this case in a fair and transparent legal process in accordance with local law and in a manner that also respects international human rights. We're providing all possible consular assistance to Ms. Hijazi. We meet with her frequently, I think most recently on October 11th. We've attended her last court hearing and will attend upcoming hearings.
Right, but so you want her? I mean, it's been 2 years. I'm not sure I understand. One, why you're still calling for a speedy legal process when it's clearly not very speedy, and two, why are you not calling for her to be released?
Well, again, because we're not. We're calling for her to have a fair, transparent, and expeditious trial.
Right. Well, so expeditious is out the window now, right?
Well,
it's been 2 years. You
I
said.
understand that, but it doesn't mitigate our desire to see, at least from this point forward, that she receive as quickly as possible a trial.
Thank you.
Yep. Guys, I gotta run. I'm sorry.